The pasta sauce aisle is one of the biggest deceptions in your grocery store. Right now, many contain almost no real tomatoes. Some of them cost $10 a jar. The pasta sauce aisle is one of the biggest deceptions in your entire grocery store. Every single jar promises Italy, with labels showing sun-ripened tomatoes and rustic kitchens. But flip it over and read the ingredients, and a completely different story starts. Modified food starch, added sugar, soybean oil, and natural flavor are common. Natural flavor legally means almost nothing. Today, we're exposing 5 brands you should put straight back on the shelf. Counting down to the worst offender, a sauce that's been America's #1 for over 40 years. Using ingredients that exist only to fake what real tomatoes were supposed to do. Then we're revealing 5 brands that actually have real tomatoes inside. Every fact in this video comes directly from the ingredient label. Let's get into it. Number 5. Bertolli tomato and basil. The one engineered to look like a premium import. Bertolli built its entire identity around one word: Italian. The name, the confident label design, the font, and above everything else, olive oil. It's not just an ingredient in this product, it's a positioning statement. It's the thing Bertolli wants you to believe separates this jar from every generic option sitting next to it on the shelf. The implication is clear. This is the sauce made with real olive oil, the way it would actually be made in Italy. Now read the back panel. Bertolli tomato and basil is manufactured in the United States. Not imported, domestic. And that olive oil being used as the brand's central credibility claim. It appears in quantities so small it contributes essentially nothing to the actual flavor of the sauce. You are not tasting olive oil. You are tasting a sauce that lists olive oil as an ingredient. Those are not the same thing, and that distinction is exactly what the front label is designed to blur. Modified cornstarch appears within the first 8 ingredients. That is not a minor detail. That is the structural explanation for why this sauce feels thick. Modified cornstarch is an industrial thickening agent. It's in this formula because the tomato base alone doesn't have enough body to feel like a real sauce. The thickening that should happen naturally when you slowly simmer quality tomatoes down. Concentrating their sugars, deepening their flavor, building natural viscosity, is instead being produced by a starch additive before the jar is ever sealed. The result is a faint, starchy coating on your palate after each bite. Sweetness is also a tell. The sauce is noticeably sweet, in a way that ripe tomatoes don't naturally produce unless they've been grown and harvested correctly. That rounded, generic sweetness is what you get when the tomato base is thin. At $5 to $6, you're paying a premium price for a sweetened, starch-padded tomato product, wearing Italian branding as a costume. The label is doing work the contents cannot. The next brand doesn't even try to look premium, and somehow that almost makes it worse. Number 4. Hunt's Traditional Pasta Sauce. The affordable one that doesn't pretend to be anything else. Hunt's costs under $2. It tastes like something that costs under $2. And unlike most brands on this avoid list, it isn't trying to convince you otherwise. No Italian village on the label, no borrowed heritage, no premium positioning. Hunt's is the straightforward budget option, which would be a reasonable category to occupy. If what was inside were actually worth cooking with. The flavor is tomato adjacent. It identifies the basic category: acidic, slightly savory, vaguely sweet. Without committing to any of those qualities convincingly. No depth, no development. It tastes like someone described tomato sauce from memory, and this is what got manufactured. There's a flatness to it that becomes more obvious the more you pay attention. The texture is the functional failure. It doesn't cling, it doesn't coat. You toss the pasta, and within 30 seconds the sauce has pulled at the bottom of the bowl. A pasta sauce that can't stay on pasta isn't performing its primary function. That's not a flavor preference, that's a structural problem with the formula. There's one thing worth noting, and it's genuinely relevant. The ingredient list is shorter than most. Tomatoes, tomato puree, salt, sugar, spices. No modified starch, no added oils, no emulsifiers. In terms of additive load, that's genuinely more restrained than several sauces charging 3 times as much. The simplicity is real, but sugar is listed. And sugar in a tomato sauce is always the same signal. The tomatoes couldn't produce enough natural sweetness on their own. So it was added afterward to patch the gap. The spices listed are a catch-all that tells you nothing specific. Oh, around 550 milligrams of sodium per half-cup serving, which adds up quickly if you're using a realistic amount on a full plate of pasta. This product is the most transparent underperformer on this list. It isn't deceiving you about what it is. It just isn't worth cooking with when better options exist at only a few dollars more. And the brand coming up next charges you 3 times as much to deliver roughly the same experience inside a significantly more convincing container. Number 3. Classico tomato and basil. The one that charges you for the jar. Classico costs $5 to $7 and it comes in glass. That glass jar is doing more work than anything inside it. The name implies something classical and deliberate. The refined label communicates a step above. The sauce you reach for when you want to feel intentional about dinner. without fully committing to reading what's actually in the bottle. Classico understood that customer precisely and built a product for them. The design does the selling, the contents don't have to. Open it and the texture is smooth to the point of having no character at all. No tomato pieces, no variation, no evidence of a vegetable that once existed in a natural, unprocessed state. It's been worked into a uniform smoothness. The kind you only achieve when consistency at scale matters more than flavor from a real ingredient. There's nothing in the texture to suggest a tomato was ever chunky, seedy, or irregularly shaped. The way tomatoes actually are. The basil registers the way a scented candle registers, uniquely present, noticeable in the most peripheral way, doing nothing meaningful for the flavor. Here's the ingredient detail that reveals the most about this product. Classico lists both citric acid and natural flavor as additives alongside the tomatoes. Tomatoes are naturally acidic. That's one of their defining characteristics as an ingredient. If a tomato sauce requires added citric acid as a separate ingredient, it means the tomatoes in the formula were not producing enough natural acidity on their own. To create a balanced, pleasant flavor, the acidity had to be manufactured and added after the fact. That's a sourcing problem dressed up as an ingredient choice. Natural flavor is the food industry's all-purpose opacity clause. It can mean almost anything. A blend of compounds that produce a desired sensory effect, and manufacturers are not required to tell you what those compounds actually are in a sauce whose entire purpose is to taste like tomatoes. The presence of natural flavor means the tomatoes alone weren't doing enough. Number 2. Ragu Old World Style Traditional. The one families have trusted for decades. Old World Style Traditional is one of the more ambitious pieces of marketing language on this entire list. It implies craft, it implies time, it implies a recipe that came from somewhere real, developed by someone who knew what they were doing and preserved carefully enough to be reproduced. At industrial scale, without losing what made it worth making in the first place. Now look at the actual ingredient list. Tomato puree, water, soybean oil, salt, sugar, dehydrated onions, citric acid, spice, natural flavor. The soybean oil is the tell. Oil doesn't belong in pasta sauce. It's in this formula for one specific reason. The tomato-to-water ratio isn't substantial enough on its own to feel like a real sauce, without added oil to create body. What's left would be too thin to function as something you'd willingly put on pasta. So instead of sourcing better tomatoes that could carry their own weight, this formula adds soybean oil to simulate a richness the base ingredient genuinely doesn't possess. You are eating oil-emulsified tomato water that has been seasoned to smell and look like something Italian. What's left would be too thin to function as something you'd willingly put on pasta. There's a front-end burst of something tomato adjacent aggressive for about 3 seconds. And then it drops out completely. No mid-palate development, no finish. Just salt and the memory of something that briefly tasted like sauce. The texture alternates between thin and strangely thick, in a way that has nothing to do with natural variation in tomato pieces, and everything to do with multiple thickeners working imperfectly against each other. 600 milligrams of sodium per half cup. The added sugar on the ingredient list. Dehydrated onions instead of fresh. $2 to $3 a jar, which sounds like genuine value. Until you understand that the value is entirely in the label, not what the label is protecting. Ragu's survival is built on price and shelf presence. They're in every store. They're the cheapest, clearly visible option in the aisle. And they're betting on you not pausing to ask why a sauce with this many ingredients still manages to taste like very little. The brand coming up next has been running that same strategy for longer. At a far larger scale, with significantly more confidence. Number 1. Prego Traditional. The one that's been in your life since before you were making your own grocery decisions. Prego launched in 1981, over 40 years on the same shelves in virtually every grocery store in America. That kind of shelf presence doesn't happen because a product is exceptional. It happens because a product becomes the default. And defaults are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge once they're established. You don't choose Prego, you reach for it. The same way you reach for any object that has occupied the same space in your peripheral vision. For your entire adult life, in that time, Prego has perfected one specific thing, tasting inoffensive enough that you never feel strongly enough to stop buying it. That is not a compliment. That is a calculated business outcome. The flavor is what you get when the design goal is to produce something that registers as tomato sauce. Without triggering any negative reaction and strong enough to prompt a switch. It doesn't taste wrong, it doesn't taste particularly right. It tastes like the broadest possible interpretation of the category, acidic enough to be recognized as sauce, sweet enough not to be sharp, smooth enough not to surprise anyone. It is a flavor profile built to generate the fewest complaints, not the most satisfaction. The sweetness is the first thing that arrives, and it is not the sweetness of a ripe, well-grown tomato. Added sugar appears in the first few ingredients. In a pasta sauce, sugar is not a seasoning choice. It is a correction. It means the tomatoes used in this formula are not naturally sweet enough to produce a balanced product, so sweetness is added industrially to fill the gap. The one that's been in your life since before you were making your own grocery decisions. A half-cup serving, roughly 4 tablespoons of sauce, contains 650 milligrams of sodium. That is 28% of the recommended daily intake in 4 tablespoons. If you've ever cooked pasta for yourself, you know 4 tablespoons barely covers 1 corner. Modified food starch is in this formula to make the sauce feel more substantial. Like what it's supposed to be. These are not supporting characters, they are structural components. In a household that's using it regularly, the ingredient list puts tomato puree first, which is technically fine. Tomato puree is just tomatoes and water. But within the next 5 ingredients, you encounter modified food starch, sugar, and natural flavor. Modified food starch is in this formula to make the sauce feel more substantial. Than the tomato base alone is capable of feeling. Natural flavor is in this formula. Because the tomatoes weren't producing enough flavor for the product to taste convincingly. Like what it's supposed to be. These are not supporting characters, they are structural components. Remove them, and what's left isn't a product that can sell at this volume. Prego exists on every shelf in every store because it became the automatic choice. Not the most satisfaction. "12 minutes to dinner," familiar label, cart already moving. The second you flip this jar over and read it carefully, the 40-year story begins to look very different from the one on the front. This is the most purchased pasta sauce in America. That fact tells you considerably more about how grocery shopping actually works than it tells you about how this sauce actually tastes. Now that you know what to put back, here is what to reach for instead. These 5 brands looked at the same ingredient options, the same cost pressures, and the same shelf competition, and made fundamentally different decisions. Best option number 3. Muir Glen Organic Tomato Basil. The clean mid-price choice that proves the $5 tier doesn't have to mean compromise. Muir Glen grows its tomatoes in California's Sacramento Valley. That is the entire pitch. No borrowed Italian mythology. No invented grandmother. No village illustration on the label. Just tomatoes from a specific named place. Grown using organic farming practices. Processed without a chemistry intervention. To make them taste like something they aren't. The texture is the first difference you notice. And it's immediately meaningful. Visible tomato pieces, chunks that confirm a real vegetable was involved. And wasn't processed into anonymity. Natural variation in consistency. That happens when you don't over-homogenize the base ingredient. It moves and behaves the way food made from real ingredients actually behaves, which sounds like a low bar until you've spent time with the avoid list and understood how consistently that bar goes uncleared. The basil is herbal, present, and integrated into the sauce. Rather than announced on top of it, it behaves the way basil actually behaves when it's genuinely part of the recipe. From the beginning, not dried, and added at the end as a label qualifier. The full ingredient list: organic tomatoes, organic tomato puree, organic extra virgin olive oil, Organic onion, sea salt, organic garlic, organic basil, organic black pepper, citric acid. 9 ingredients. Every one of them is identifiable as a real food except the citric acid. And it's immediately meaningful. Visible tomato pieces, chunks that confirm a real vegetable was involved. Critically, it is not here to artificially sharpen a flavor the tomatoes were supposed to produce. And didn't. That distinction separates this use of citric acid from what you saw in the Classico formula. 310 milligrams of sodium per half cup, the lowest sodium count of anything on the avoid list. And competitive with everything in the best section, $5 to $7, the exact same price range as Classico and Bertolli.